In 1949, someone who worked minimum wage over the summer would have enough money to buy the following items from that year's Sears catalog: a Smith Corona typewriter, Argus 21 35mm camera, Silvertone AM/FM table radio, and a Silvertone 3-speed phonograph. In 2009, that same person, working the same number of hours at minimum wage, would now be able to purchase a Dell laptop computer, HP color ink printer, a scanner, a copier, a Canon 8-megapixel digital camera, a portable GPS system, a 32-inch LCD HD TV television, an 8-gigabyte iPod Nano, a GE microwave, a Haier refrigerator freezer, a Toshiba DVD VCR combo, an RCA home theater system, a Uniden cordless telephone, RCA AM/FM radio, a camcorder, a Sony PlayStation 2, and about 7 other things, but I think you get the point. Capitalism promotes innovation and competition, 2 ingredients necessary for producing things that get progressively better, even as they also get progressively cheaper. The truth is that a minimum wage worker in America is still one of the wealthiest people in the world. Now, does that preclude us from trying to make things even better? Absolutely not. But those who are favoring throwing away the system that made us the envy of the world are either dangerously naive or they have an agenda. You can probably identify which group they belong to by whether they make idiotic arguments like, "Your precious free market capitalism has failed."
Capitalism hasn't failed. Greed has failed. Think about it like this. You're a doctor with 50 sick patients, all of whom have the exact same symptoms. 20 of your patients are women, the rest are men. 10 of your patients are Asian, 5 are Arab, 5 are Mexican, 5 are African American, and the rest are Caucasian. They have varying hair colors and all are different heights and weights. Some smoke and drink, some do neither. In other words, these 50 people seem to have nothing in common, yet they all have the same disease. Look around the world right now. Virtually every country is sick. Communists, socialists, capitalists, and everything in between. It doesn't matter. The global recession infected everyone. Yet we look at all of these countries with all of their different styles of government and different views on economic freedom, and we come to one nonsensical conclusion. Capitalism has failed. How can that be possible? The only thing those countries have in common is they all fell victim to the idea that returns could be had without risk. Or, to put it another way, they all succumbed to greed. If you could trace the economic crisis back to one seminal event, you'd probably point the finger at the collapse of the U.S. housing market. But was that collapse triggered by a failure of capitalism, or by an abuse of it by the government? Under true free market capitalism, the government would have no involvement in home ownership whatsoever. They wouldn't encourage it through artificially low interest rates, Fannie and Freddie, tax breaks, or a Community Reinvestment Act, but they wouldn't discourage it either. Rates would be set by market participants based on risk, reward, and a clear understanding that making bad loans would result in bankruptcy. But we've done the complete opposite of that. The housing market is manipulated by the government every step of the way. So while some may argue that we need more regulation to prevent these future excesses, I would argue that it's the existing regulations that created those excesses in the first place. In other words, what has failed isn't the idea of free markets, it's the idea that a market can be free when it's run by an increasingly activist government.
Oh, sure, it's always the government's fault. Hey, let's play your little game and get the government out of everything. Who will help the poor? We have an obligation to take care of our weakest, and only the government can fill that role.
Great, we kind of agree on something. We do have an obligation to help. But I think I have a different definition of we than you do. The kind of capitalism that has failed is soulless capitalism. Because success without compassion results in greed and excess, and we had plenty of both. But that soullessness didn't come out of nowhere. It was bred by a government that continually tries to step in to do the jobs that individual Americans should be responsible for. We have never solved problems efficiently from the top down. We solve them from the bottom up. In countries with strong central governments, the people with the money and power are the politicians instead of the businessmen. Are those politicians selfless and charitable? Of course not. They're greedy and corrupt, and the poor are even worse off than they are here. My point is that capitalism itself is just a vehicle. We're the drivers. Any economic system will inevitably fail if individuals stop caring about the welfare of others. But which economic system is more likely to drive people out of poverty? One that cherishes the slogan, "from rags to riches," or one that aims to help the poor via government bureaucracy? If you're struggling to answer that, consider what happened in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Less than 1 month after the hurricane, private donations surpassed the $1 billion mark, most of which went to private aid organizations that quickly provided relief. Meanwhile, FEMA handed out $6.3 billion in taxpayer money, with nearly a quarter of that going to scammers. According to a GAO report, FEMA gave cash to inmates, sent checks to people who said they lived in cemeteries or post office boxes, and reimbursed people for rent even though they were living in hotels that were already being paid for by FEMA. Oh, and remember those FEMA debit cards? Well, according to the GAO, it turns out they were occasionally used for purchases that, prepare yourself for government speak, did not appear to meet legitimate disaster needs. In other words, people spent money meant for food and shelter on jewelry, travel, and porn. Just for good measure, FEMA also reportedly lost 381 debit cards worth $762,000. For some reason, we've become accustomed to the idea that government must always come to the aid of everyone, but it hasn't always been that way. Those in need used to rely on each other for help. In 1887, Congress passed a bill appropriating money to Texas farmers who were suffering through a catastrophic drought. These days, that funding would not only be authorized, it would probably be done so under an emergency program that gave more money to the farmers than they ever dreamed of. But not in 1887. Not with Grover Cleveland as president. Here's how he answered Congress's request.
I feel obliged to withhold my approval of the plan, as proposed by this bill, to indulge a benevolent and charitable sentiment through the appropriation of public funds for that purpose. I can find no warrant for such an appropriation in the Constitution, and I do not believe that the power and duty of the general government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering which is in no manner properly related to the public service or benefit. A prevalent tendency to disregard the limited mission of this power and duty should, I think, be steadfastly resisted, to the end that the lesson should be constantly enforced that though the people support the government should not support the people.
Time out. Maybe you need to pause and catch your breath. Go get a glass of water if you need to. Better? Okay, now listen to the rest of his response.
The friendliness and charity of our countrymen can always be relied upon to relieve their fellow citizens in misfortune. This has been repeatedly and quite lately demonstrated. Federal aid in such cases encourages the expectation of paternal care on the part of the government and weakens the sturdiness of our national character, while it prevents the indulgence among our people of that kindly sentiment and conduct which strengthens the bonds of a common brotherhood.
Wow. Even more impressive was that Cleveland, who was a Democrat, turned out to be 100% right. Those fellow citizens he put so much trust in donated 10 times more money to those farmers than the amount the president had vetoed. Once again proving that when individuals personally sacrifice to help each other, it not only makes us better people, it makes us a better country. It forces us to notice need, instead of simply hiring corrupt politicians to notice it only when they can exploit, publicize, or politicize it. Unfortunately, Cleveland's unwavering belief in the individual didn't last long. It was squashed just a few years after his second term, when progressive Republican Teddy Roosevelt took over and said idiotic things like, "Every man holds his property subject to the general right of the community to regulate its use to whatever degree the public welfare may require it." It just goes to show you that the R and the D are meaningless. What really matters is whether someone believes in the spirit and unending compassion of the individual, or instead, in the destructive power of the collective.
Excuse me, ADD moment. May I approach the bench, Your Honor? After reading about his stand for the Constitution and small government, I suddenly became very interested in Mr. Cleveland. Turns out, you didn't want to mess with him when it came to federal money. Time after time, President Cleveland turned down seemingly small, harmless requests from people looking for federal help.